Good morning, afternoon, or evening to you. This is Patrick Coble. I'm a security nerd at VDISEC, where we focus on VDI security. And we're going to address some tales from the trenches with some security first development with my friend, Mr. Kurt.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Roemer, Chief Security Strategist and a member of the Office of the CTO at Citrix.
All right, well, let's get into it. The obligatory disclaimer. And today we'll kind of go through what I've seen in some of the trenches doing security audits and things like that. And then we'll turn it over to Kurt to kind of figure out how we can secure first development, how we can do that to make our applications more secure and make it more beneficial for our users. And then we'll have some thoughts and questions from both of us at the end. And so let's just get shaking and baking here. So what do I see when I are in the security trenches when I'm assessing security VDI deployments? Well, I see a lot of deployments from the EUC's perspective when it comes to best practices and performance. And then I see a lot of security things where a lot of security practices just are not followed in many cases. And a lot of people will always come back to documentation, that if we just make more documentation, that will solve this problem. But there's already a lot of documentation out there from Citrix, Microsoft, and other people. But it only ever goes so far because most documentation even isn't used at the time of deployment, especially when we're talking about hundreds or even thousands of pages of documentation. And one of those big lessons that I see time and time again is deployments are deployed at ramming speed, right? There is no mercy. It's just as fast as possible because there's always a product, there's always a deadline, there's always milestones that have to be made. And so when that's getting built, it's getting that VDA connected to as fast as possible is what is the main priority. And when we talk about those priorities just within the deployment, the first is functional. You have to make the product work. It has to launch. We got to get working. We can access application from inside and outside. All right, cool. Second is not for security. I wish it was as a security nerd, but it's really for user fixes. We got to fix all the things, the icons, the shortcuts. We missed a program. We forgot to change the background to blue. Some of this stuff gets very, very minor, but a lot of those. But then maybe 42nd on the list might be security. And that's because everyone's thought is that we'll get to it one day, but sometimes that one day is a couple years later. And the next thing I see is that people think that Citrix is not just deployed for Citrix, it's deployed for these applications. And what kind of applications do I see most common? Of course, Microsoft Windows and all the apps, especially in the Office suite. A lot of web applications, tons of Internet Explorer published, tons of Chrome, a little bit of Firefox, but mostly Chrome and Internet Explorer. And Citrix is probably most known for its healthcare workloads for EMRs, which have PHI in them, and they're deployed all over the place. The next is banking, tellers, and stuff like that. And then also retail, where there's payment card information inside those sessions, whether it's the support staff or it's the point of sale itself. And then with governments, you also have PII, personal information that could be stored on government employees. We've seen breaches of that with like OPM and things like that a couple years ago. And then you have SaaS applications, which are published through Citrix. It's a little bit newer use case, but it's still valid, or they're still accessing that SaaS application through a published desktop or through the web application that you're publishing through there. And probably the tried and true work case is work from anywhere. That's what Citrix was kind of founded on, any device, anywhere, and any app, obviously, too. But that's the big one. And then you're going to have a lot of people that have those secret squirrel applications that are proprietary applications that have to be ran in their data center or their cloud of choice with their backend. They're not off-the-shelf applications that we would be used to. And so those are kind of the applications that drive people and use cases for work from anywhere, is drive Citrix deployments. And so let's talk about trust. People inherently trust security settings for Microsoft and Citrix, right, as part of this. Now, there are, of course, Linux VDAs and stuff like that, but for most part, most things are Microsoft VDAs. And so, but by default, Microsoft Windows will let you run anything. It might not let you install something, but it'll let you run. And a prime example of that is malware and any malicious software. It just runs, it isn't installed. That phishing email, that malicious document or shady program that someone clicks, that is that thing that is running, not installing. And when we talk about session policies, this is so we just said that Microsoft is allowing anything to execute in the operating system unless you tune it otherwise. Citrix is also within the CVAD session policies is allowing you to copy paste, printer mapping, and other drive mappings, your audio in and out. And by default, I always recommend locking everything down and only opening it up for the people that actually need it. That Active Directory group for the same that you're using for the delivery group for the EMR, that may be the one where you're going to say, hey, I need to allow it for this user, this nurse, this physician, this manager, this employee, whichever way it works. Copy and paste is the most common deviation that we have to open it back up. I always question what format, what type of text do they need, whether it's structured or unstructured, and then the directionality. Which way should it go? Within the session, out of the session? And then we always have printing is definitely second, right? We always have to allow printing in many cases. And then we also look at drive mappings, but both of those could be controlled within WIM once the session's up, depending on the use case. USB is prohibited by default, which is great, but in a lot of cases, you're going to need to open that up for scanners, headsets, and other devices, depending on what you're doing. Audio may seem benign to many people, but when I do audits in the medical or legal world, dictation is used very often. And that becomes very sensitive audio recordings, right? Or maybe even meeting notes. So we talk about those session policies and those default session policies. This is kind of an eyesore, but this shows you some of the CVAD defaults, the Microsoft WVD, Horizon, and AWS defaults. And if we look at Citrix and Horizon, they're almost clones of each other of what's allowed by default and what's not. But then you look at the end, you look at Microsoft, a lot of those things are not on by default or even not available. And then when we look at AWS, they took an approach of everything's locked down except audio and copy and paste. And so it's a really interesting way to look at that. And so we talk about what can we do as developers and Citrix staff to do. These are all the kind of common tasks that I see that take people's times, especially when we talk about XML, the base URL, the default certificate hasn't been replaced, swapping to HTTP to HTTPS no matter what. So if we could make wizards to ask about the workload that they're doing, we could help tune that basic security stance. As in, do we know that there's PCI, PII, PHI? Yes. Well, maybe by default, if someone says the workload, that delivery group has that, we need to lock these things down. And there's obviously things that we could do on the VDA, on that the execution platform, to see if AppLocker is being enabled, or WDAC for Windows Defender, or if PowerShell logging restrictions are on, or if event logs are being forwarded off the system. We could look at the system and catch up on quite a few things. So we know the defaults are rarely changed and that those defaults are not secure. We want to make it secure by design for new deployments, but we need to also make sure we don't forget about existing deployments, since they're still the lion's share of this. And so with that, Kurt, let's talk about that SecurityFirst design.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. As developers, we have a lot of things to think about. And so as you go through and take a look at developing with SecurityFirst as your mantra, wanted to introduce the shared responsibility model that we're much more familiar with here in 2020 and beyond. A couple of security frameworks you want to keep in mind throughout the development processes. Patrick had talked about some of those secure defaults, so I'm not going to get into too much more on that, but we'll spend some time talking about data, APIs, services, and then really how we can leverage zero trust moving forward. So first of all, from a shared responsibility model, take a look at this list. In the past, who was responsible for making sure that any application that was rolled out was meeting the needs to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover? Well, most people, even earlier this year, would have said this is IT's responsibility end to end. And these days, these shared responsibilities really begin with architecture and development and go all the way through to administration and usage and eventually retirement. We've got to think about these as a set of shared responsibilities, identifying not just whose responsibilities they are, but how they transition, how they may change when somebody's in a business resumption or disaster recovery type of model or workforce continuity, and ultimately what gaps might exist and how we can identify those gaps and how we can programmatically be able to codify those in so that people are aware of them and it's something that we're working to actively remediate. And a little more detail on the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you take a look at this, these 5 key areas are core functions, and note that it says they're performed concurrently and continuously. This isn't something you just do once and hand off to someone else. And it really is about an organizational culture and being able to match risk. And we'll talk more about matching to risk as we move forward. But this NIST framework is extremely important. I'm going to give several areas where you as developers can take a look into each of these areas and maybe identify some development practices or maybe even some products you can pull out of it. So first, let's begin with identify. And as you take a look at being able to identify and develop that organizational understanding, you're looking at this across systems, assets, data, capabilities, but you're also taking a look into much more detail of how, as a developer, you can help to codify some of this, and increasingly being able to implement metadata and have that as part of your services and as your API framework so that you can make very fast decisions on the data without having to read the entire data set. As we move into data sets that go beyond simple databases and include streaming and video increasingly, metadata is very important and a big time saver, but also can be great from a data classification perspective. The analytics and AI and ML are also extremely important to build in, and these really exist through all of these. But as you look at identify going into protect, it's a lot of what people have thought about in the past is how do you go through and implement various controls, and what can you do to make sure that you're safeguarding that data and services. A couple of things from the Citrix side is think very specifically about how you utilize browser sessions, whether you want to kick those off in CVAD, whether you want to kick those off as a cloud-based browser service, whether you want to utilize the embedded browser that's part of Workspace app. These are all things that you can do these days as you're accessing SaaS and web and cloud-based applications. And from a developer perspective, these are various areas that you can help administrators with programmatically coding in what you want to happen as various risk levels cross, or maybe give them the decisions, but have it automatically kick in at the point of request or the point of service. Okay, and then as we move on into detect, you want to be looking for specific threats, and you want to look at evolving threats. One of the areas that you'll definitely want to utilize is Citrix Analytics to help make sure that you're doing correlation of events and not just maybe looking at raw events in total, but also looking at how Citrix Analytics is going to go ahead and provide correlations so that you've got a much bigger picture of what a specific event is. Maybe it's somebody who is a malicious insider, or maybe it's somebody who's just trying to work around a security policy that's getting in their way or one that they don't understand, and something that you can go back and either provide additional user education or modify the program so it matches more closely the way people are actually trying to use it, and obviously leads to better security outcomes by doing that. Another point that I want to highlight on this slide is the ability for crowdsourcing. As developers, we've got the opportunity to bring in data from many different sources, and particularly when you're looking at detection, this is extremely important. So take a look at those services, whether they exist on premises as part of products or whether they're services that are out in the cloud. All right, and then as we look at respond, increasingly we need to make sure that our systems and even our data are self-protecting and that they're able to help make sure that they take care of some of the more common ways that the application and data are attacked and can respond appropriately, automated whenever possible. Applications have gotten very complicated these days, so being able to build in an automated response process, or at least kick it off through workflow, is extremely important. And utilizing the workflow capabilities, you can actually define escalations, correlations, and other areas where the application can go through and engage human response when that particular type of decision is needed, when a certain threshold's been crossed. And then the last piece in the NIST model is recover. We need to make sure that as we're recovering data, as we're recovering applications, as we're bringing things back up, we're checking to make sure that all dependencies have been satisfied and we're not bringing up an application without a key security service that absolutely has to be there. So codify those dependencies and the entire service chain so that you make sure that critical security functionality is there. Also, if there has been a particular incident, let's say something like ransomware, make sure that you're reissuing all roots of trust, all certificates, all keys. You've got a great way for the application to go through and be able to define a new epoch from a trust perspective, and really need to be doing that moving forward and having those capabilities, because we know the attacks are increasingly going to happen. We need to make sure that we can reduce them in severity as much as possible, contain them as much as possible, and recover appropriately as quickly as possible. And Patrick, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, from a recovery perspective, how do we know when we're dealing with the next normal?
Yeah, it's definitely a big deal, and it's going to be changing. That this is, I think, people aren't going to turn a light switch on and just go right back to normal. And so the new security stances that we have only need to be strengthened. And that's because it's going to be the most common attack vector. Everyone's going to be working from home or not in the office as much anymore. So breaking into the office won't be as a valid way to get into a deployment. So the next normal is now, and especially going forward with how we develop and secure products, because everyone is going to be using them.
Great, thank you. The next framework that I wanted to highlight is the Microsoft SecOn framework. And you've got various levels within here, depending on the sensitivity of data that somebody's working with, or the reach, or the particular administrator or their workstation. And if you notice over on the right-hand side, the privileged access workstations are really focused on DevOps and administrators. Make sure that as you're developing applications, that you are utilizing those DevOps and administrator models to protect information that contains sensitive source code and intellectual property, keys and certificates and other secrets, and maybe even including some of the contracts that you're working with. Definitely think along these models, and when you're developing and you've got usage that's for a fairly low level from a risk perspective, that you're working with primarily public data, you don't have to engage all of the highest security factors to verify that. You maybe just want to make sure that you're verifying integrity. But as you continue to work with increasingly sensitive data and needs for confidentiality, integrity, and safety on top of that, you want to make sure that you're operating much more at level 1 and level 2. And Microsoft's got a lot of great resources for showing how to set up these privileged access workstations. And you can even set up a virtual PAW if you'd want as well. And then the next framework is a MITRE ATT&CK framework. And this one's definitely a bit of an eye chart unless you've got a massive monitor in front of you right now. But for those of you who are on 13-inch screens or smaller, I know you're going to struggle to read this, which is why I made sure that you've got the URL on here that you can go to. But the MITRE ATT&CK framework is very useful for taking a look at how applications are attacked and what are some of the various areas that you need to consider to be able to develop the application in a more secure way and be able to handle the various attack vectors, threats, and make sure that you're reporting on this as well. So definitely something I'd welcome you taking a look at in a lot more detail. All right, now let's talk a little bit about data. Patrick before had talked about PII, PHI, PCI, and intellectual property. And we do need to make sure that we're looking at those as all of the different data types that they could be containing these days, and all the different places that this data is coming from, how that data is correlated, and how those correlations may change the data classification from something that's not very sensitive to something that could be seen as extremely sensitive, or something that's more targeted at an individual and might be something you need to be concerned about in terms of their right to be forgotten. It's very helpful for developers to go through and do some threat modeling and understand how their application could be utilized, what some of the corner cases are, and how the data flows through it. And if you've got the opportunity to work with DLP, definitely do. If you're not familiar with DLP for helping to control sensitive data as a developer, spend some time getting up to speed on that. There's some great services you can interface with these days. And then also from an identity and ownership model, that shared responsibility model definitely applies through here. And when you think about identity, really think about these days as the identity of everything. Everything that you do needs to have identity associated with it so that you can go back and verify those shared responsibilities, be able to look for gaps. And increasingly, you want to make sure that you're looking at ownership not just as an assigned ownership, but how that ownership actually plays out and how it's working as people are utilizing the application. Very important as you have third parties involved and multiple providers that are not only providing data into the application, but also providing services as well as using that information moving forward. So there's a lot that you can engage from an AI ML perspective here. And talked a little bit about data classification before, but increasingly we're moving towards this as an industry where data is going to be self-protecting, and increasingly though now it's helpful to think about that ahead of time and define the data protection needs for your application as you're developing it, but also go through and periodically review that in light of the new threat landscape to make sure that those assumptions are still valid. And take the time to actually document the assumptions, because as they change, you'll want to make sure to highlight those, note those, and look at their impact on the application, on its usage, on the data, and on any regulations that it may apply to. Very helpful to have that information documented and have that out there for normal usage of the application, but also as you get into things like e-discovery and audits. And then more and more we're seeing applications being developed as APIs and being able to utilize APIs and bring APIs together to deliver portions of the application. Citrix has an API gateway that utilizes OAS spec files and helps you not only define what the API does, what resources and methods it has access to, but also what security measures it would need, and allows you to apply those security measures through the API gateway. It's extremely helpful to go through and utilize this, and as you're utilizing APIs within your applications, think about utilizing the API gateway. Spend some time getting in depth on what this can do for your application to automate a lot of security, be able to keep up with changes to the applications and to APIs, particularly external APIs, and give you the ability to affect better security outcomes. Patrick, how do you see the need for API protection in your calls from the trenches?
Yeah, so out there in the trenches, most people have no security whatsoever on their APIs. I do a lot of work with big healthcare organizations, HL7 data is very critical to them and has sensitive information in it, and it's just coming and going and being shared here, and it's externally posted to this company and that company. So most people that have APIs, it's just the same server with some of those same practices where event logging might not be forwarded. There's no access restriction. Any device can talk to the API server instead of some kind of firewall or segmentation. So there definitely needs to be something, a push to secure APIs, because APIs are most likely, if you've got them, they're controlling your whole deployment, and they could also affect you very bad monetarily, because as soon as someone finds out how to work or break into your API, they're going to try to suck down as much data as they can, and you'll end up on the news. So getting some kind of API gateway from Citrix will definitely help prevent some of those attacks, and or just give you the visibility that you know something new or weird is going on right now.
Yep, thanks. All right, finishing off some of our thoughts on data, we've got a data lifecycle management model example highlighted on the right-hand side. Make sure that as you're thinking about data, you're thinking about data all the way from its inception through usage, appropriate usage, hopefully, and then through to disposal. And you need to think about data provenance and sovereignty and classification of data and how it's moving, particularly in light of a lot of regulations these days and the calls for certain types of data to stay within region, within country, or within things like GovClouds. So make sure that you're considering that. But most important is, don't think about this as something that's just done periodically. Think about continuously being audit ready and making sure that your application provides all of the data and insights and reporting so that you can be continuously audit ready and support those needs. Most organizations are moving towards that type of model right now very aggressively. And finally, I'm going to wrap up a little bit with the need for zero trust. Zero trust is, of course, the mantra where you're not providing for any implied trust or assumed trust, and you're saying that all trust must be verified. And when you are developing, you want to make sure that you're building on a foundation of zero trust. When you do that, you're making sure that everything you do is continuously situationally aware and contextually risk appropriate. And as you think in terms of being continuously situationally aware and contextually risk appropriate, it's about looking at changing situations. Are people working from new locations? Is my data in a new location? Are people working from different devices with different capabilities? And how do you assess those? Is somebody working on a particular sensitive project? Is somebody now going from being a normal user in the application to being an administrator? Those situations are constantly being updated. And with that, how do you make sure that you're applying what I call the 5 W's of context: who, what, when, where, and why, to look at how context is changing and then adapt to be in a risk-appropriate way. So zero trust is really all about this and making sure that you're doing continuous assessment and continuous response. Got a lot of those policies built into CVAD and Citrix ADC and the rest of the infrastructure, and we can definitely help you with those zero trust development projects. And speaking of projects, we want to leave you with a couple of resources, TechZone, some of our CVAD developer docs, and for those of you who are either moving to cloud, using some cloud services, curious about cloud, go out to developer.cloud.com and check out some of those resources, as well as looking at the API gateway. And on top of that, Patrick and I have a challenge for you. Converge Hackathon is going on. We encourage you to participate with that. Hopefully you've got something in this year. If you didn't already, definitely be considering this for the next time that we run Converge. We threw out a lot of ideas in this presentation that I think developers could run with and produce something really cool from a hackathon perspective. So we look forward to hearing what resonated well, what you're working on, and look forward to seeing you in a hackathon coming up soon. Patrick?
Yeah, so the main thing there is, we need you. Security is a team sport, and especially with the developers of the product. And so think about how you can make your products more secure and audit ready on an ongoing basis. What features or wizards or compliance scanners could you make to check the security of a new and or existing deployment? And then think about time management. What task could you automate to give the admins more time to support their users, or also replace, and also secure their deployment later, right? Like SSL certificate replacement and things like that. And then just know that one of the things in the security world is that better analytics and just visibility can help admins configure things. So we know what applications are being executed, so maybe we can help suggest policies to only allow those executables to be executed. We know that this executable launches another one, so we could give the users that visibility and analytics to know what's actually being done in that session and what could we do to further secure it too, right? So first, thank you, Kurt, for the opportunity. It was a good session. I hope everyone enjoyed and learned some things, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
And thank you, everyone.
Thank y'all. Have a great one.